Amen. So we're kicking off this new series, and it's going to be a quick series. It's just 2 parts. And originally, I was going to share with you a passage from Acts chapter 12, and then next week we're going to go into Acts chapter 22, but that all changed this week. And so now I'm just going to share 5 verses out of Acts chapter 12, and then next week we'll pick up the rest of it, because I don't want us to move past this passage too quickly. It's a powerful word, and it's heavy, and it's filled with this incredible message from God, I think, for us as a church. And so these next couple of weeks, we're gonna be talking about this idea of urgency, of what it means to live an urgent life, what it means to live with urgency. And I was kind of reminded, even most recently, this has been something that's been on my heart, I think, since the spring, and something that I've been working on and working out for us, for today. But I was reminded on Friday when I went to speak at this small church up in Ronnieville, Kentucky, just about the urgency that we're called to live with. And so they were in the tail end of a revival. So I got they do a revival, I think, last night and maybe again tonight, and that'll bring their big 7-day revival to an end. And I was kind of towards the tail end of it, and I started off that message because I had no idea how I was going to start it, and it just so happened that how I started it there is going to play into here. So there you go. But I had no idea how I was going to start, and I was just asking God, Lord, what is it? How do you want me to get into the passage that you've given me to give to them? How do you want me to get there? How do you want me to work there? And I just thought back to how we started this year off together. And for those of you who were around back in January, we started off this year together in an incredible way. We started off this year together in revival. So I'm going to speak at a revival that's going on for 7 days. But we started off our year together as a church in a series called Revival. So we didn't do it back to back to back to back, and we didn't do it for 6 weeks back to back, because I figured y'all probably wouldn't show up to church for 6 weeks straight in a row, just night after night. So we kind of broke up the whole idea of revival, and we just did it on Sunday mornings. So Sunday morning, we had this word from God, and then we try to keep you engaged throughout the week so that idea of revival, that spirit of revival, wouldn't go away. And then we would come back together, and we'd get another nugget of it, and then we would get this another nugget of it, and just carried it out for 6 weeks together. But there was one thing that carried us throughout that whole series together. It was a prayer from a guy named Gypsy Smith. How many of you all were here in January for the revival series and you remember the Gypsy Smith prayer? Just raise your hand for a moment. Yeah, so just actually, that's crazy. I thought I would see more hands than that. There was this prayer, so this is going to be brand new for a lot of you. There was this prayer that we were praying together as a church from this revivalist who lived during the late 1800s, and that's how I started this past Friday night at this revival. It's like, this was a prayer for us. It was a prayer that, honestly, I had kind of forgotten about, and I needed to be reminded of. And so I just started off, and I got down on my knees, which is what I did in January, and I was telling them the story about this guy named Gypsy Smith. And so Gypsy Smith was this revivalist back from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And to keep a long story kind of short, just for our intents and purposes this morning, Gypsy Smith was a different kind of evangelist. He was a different kind of preacher. Whenever Gypsy Smith would go somewhere and preach a revival, people talked about the lasting impact, the lasting change that it had on them. And so there was something different about his revivals than other people's revivals. And so it wasn't just that he was a great orator of the faith. God was doing something when he gathered people together. And when Gypsy Smith would leave there and go on to his next place, or go back to England where he was from, as he was traveling all over, man, there was a movement that began that would carry on in people's lives. And so people started asking, man, what's the secret to your revival? How is it that you're able to do something that nobody else is able to do? Why is it that people leave with a different sense about them after your revivals than they are other revivals? And Gypsy Smith just responded, and he says, I don't know if it's a secret, but I'll tell you what I do. When I get to where God is calling me, before I speak, I go into a room by myself and I close the door. And he carried a piece of chalk with him. And he said, and I get down on my knees, and I take this piece of chalk, and I draw a circle around myself. And he said, and I just start praying. And I said, God, we need a revival, and I pray that you would start that revival in this circle. Like, start the revival with me. And then he goes on in his prayer, and he says, God, open my eyes to your presence, to your work around me. Open my eyes that I might see you at work in my midst. God, convict my heart, my life. Convict me of the sin in my life. And God, give me a heart for people who are far from you. And he says, that's essentially what I pray. Everyone, God, we need a revival. Start it with me. Open my eyes that I might see you at work. God, convict me of the sin in my life and give me a heart for those who are far from you. And I'm sharing that with you because I don't know if I can describe it to you, but there was a sense of urgency that began to build in that small church in Rineyville, Kentucky on Friday night just from that prayer alone. Just from telling that story, it was like there was this sense of urgency that started to build. People weren't leaning away from it. They began to lean into it. It's amazing what purpose will do to urgency. See, urgency is a response. I want you to write that down. Urgency is a response. Urgency isn't something that comes without response, but urgency is a response. It's something. There's got to be something that happens. There has to be purpose. Hey, can y'all put that up on the screen? Thank you. Urgency is a response, and so it is a response to something. Most of the time, we think about it in the context of emergency, right? Emergency creates urgency, but that shouldn't be the way it always is. Like, yeah, sure, there's an emergency that creates urgency, but if urgency is a response, it doesn't have to necessarily be because of an emergency kind of situation. The first church, the early church, man, they lived with urgency, not just in the face of crisis, not just in the face of suffering, but they lived with an urgency because of the call of the gospel, that what had happened through the cross and the resurrection had changed their lives. It wasn't just something, a set of beliefs that they ascribed to. It wasn't just something that they had believed in. It is something that changed them and moved them. It changed the way they lived. It changed the way they lived their life and community together. It changed the way they interacted with people. They were living with an urgency as a response to the gospel. And so a question I want to begin with this series and with you with is simply this. I mean, do you live your life with urgency in response to the gospel? Do you live your life with a sense of urgency, a sense of drive, a sense of focus, a sense of purpose because of the gospel and the message of the gospel in your life? Does the message of the cross and the resurrection and the hope that we have, I mean, can you sing a song about running out of the grave without going, I don't know if I like this? But hold on to the message of the song. Hold on to the truth that it's proclaiming from the gospel, that the Almighty God himself would call your name. And when he does, it is the power of life over death. It is the power that can call you out of the grave and out of the mud and out of the mire and into life itself in him. I mean, does the gospel cause something in you to rise up, to live with a sense of urgency, to live as if, man, you don't have all the time on earth? A lot of times we live like we have all the time in the world, but we don't have all the time in the world. And I don't want this whole message to turn dark or anything, and I don't want us to, just totally dampen the mood in here. But the reality is, man, we only have so much time. It's those moments when we wake up that we only have so much time that we begin to live with a little more urgency. It's those moments when we wake up and we go, look, I may not have all the time that I think I've got. We begin to wake up and we live with urgency. When you look at the story of Acts, it's the story of the early church. It's the early church acting out their responsibility and their response to the gospel. Man, you see a group of people that are living their lives with an urgency, and they are seeing these incredible things of God happen. And so I want to take you to a story that you may or may not be familiar with. It's Acts chapter 12. And we're going to go through several of these verses together over the next couple of weeks, but today, just 5 verses. And I want to read just a couple of them, and we'll set it up, and we'll move through it together. But this is verse 1 and 2. It says, "It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword, and when he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also." If you're taking notes this morning, I want you to write this down. Write down just this idea, living with urgency. Living with urgency. Urgency is a response. You already wrote that down. But now I want to talk about actually living with urgency. It's living with a sense of purpose. When you live with a sense of purpose, the response that often comes out of that is a sense of urgency. Listen, you ought to know what purpose you're living for. You owe it to if you don't know the purpose for which you are living, not the purpose that you would say that you're living for, if you don't know at the heart of who you are, the purpose of who you are, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, even if you showed up follower, if you're not a follower, leave you alone about coming to church, and so you're coming this time, but you're not coming back. Listen, you owe it to yourself, even if you leave Jesus completely out of it, to know what your sense of purpose is. You know why? Because living with urgency is a response to purpose. And if you're not living with urgency in your life, there's a chance that there's not that big of a purpose that you're living for. You ought to know the purpose for which you live, because living with urgency is a response to that purpose. People who live with purpose in their lives, man, they live with a sense of urgency. If the first church was living with this incredible sense of urgency that was changing the world, then they had to be living for an incredible purpose. You owe it to yourself to know the purpose for which you live. Living with purpose is driving that urgency, that sense of urgency for which you live or for which you don't. And here's the thing, it can play out in a bunch of different ways. Herod is who the story starts off with, and it says that Herod had in mind that he would begin to persecute the early church. And so the first person that he has put to death is a guy named James, right? And if you know the story, James is the brother of John. Remember how we started off before we prayed, and we talked about the story of John and Peter going, and the guy, is laying there at the gate called Beautiful, and he's begging, and he can't walk, and he gets up and walks. James is John's brother. James is one of the inner three guys who got to see things that the other disciples didn't get to see when it came to Jesus and his work during his earthly ministry. The first guy that Herod Agrippa puts to death is this guy named James, and he takes notice that, man, that made everybody else happy around him, and so he decided to move on from James and go after kind of one of the big guns, the biggest gun, if you will, in Jerusalem, and he captures Peter, and his intent is to put Peter to death. Look, Herod is living with a purpose, and he is living with a sense of urgency. When he puts James to death and notices that it pleases everybody else, man, he doesn't just go out and grab somebody else, some random, run-of-the-mill disciple and put him to death. No, he goes out and he finds Peter. There is a purpose to his life. There's an urgency, even though it's not a good urgency, when we're looking at it, there's an urgency through which he's moving. Look, living with purpose and living with urgency, it can go one way or it can go another way pretty quickly. Herod Agrippa was kind of a guy that had something to prove. And there's nothing more dangerous than being around something. Because people with something to prove usually end up pretty reckless with the way they live. They end up dangerous in the way that they're living out their life. Herod's coming from a line. Most of the time when you start talking about Herod, people think about, the guy who put all the babies to death at Christmas time. And that was one of the Herods. But that was his grandfather. Or when you talk about Herod, people think about the guy who cut the head off John the Baptist, and that was a Herod, but that was this guy's uncle. And it was like Herod Agrippa had something to prove. But here's the thing with Herod Agrippa, this guy in the story, man, what he was living for, the purpose for which he lived, it was completely different from those who were the first followers of Jesus, these leaders in the early church. Man, Herod loved the applause of people. He loved getting the praise, the applause of people. He grew up in Rome, and so when he was around Romans, man, he lived just like a Roman, but he was half Jew, and so when he was around the Jews, man, he loved living for their favor. And so when he puts James to death and he recognizes that, man, he gets some applause out of that they favor that thing, man, he just continues moving in that direction no matter what the recklessness causes. Hey, can I ask you a question just a minute, and we'll keep moving down through this? The purpose for which you're living, whatever it is that you're living for, whatever the purpose that you're living and breathing and moving for, the purpose for which you're living, the purpose that's maybe creating whatever the urgency is, man, is it causing recklessness in your life? Is it causing you to live a reckless, careless, dangerous life? Man, Herod was living with purpose. He was living with urgency, no doubt. But it cost James his life, and it cost Peter his life. And here's the thing, nobody is living their life in a vacuum. especially for those of you who have people around you and you have friends and you have family members. If you're not careful about the purpose for which you're living, if you're not careful about the urgency with which you live, then that can affect the people closest to you. That your recklessness may not just wreck your life, it could wreck their life. That your recklessness, if you're not careful, could not just wreck your own heart and your own mind, but man, it can wreck the heart of your children. If you're not careful, the recklessness may not just wreck your life and the things that have specifically to do with you, but they can wreck your marriage. They can wreck your business. They can wreck your work. They can wreck everything about you if you're not careful when it comes to your purpose, when it comes to the way that you're living, the living with urgency. If you're not careful, you could end up wrecking things that you never intended to wreck. It's like, man, I never meant to hurt anyone, and then all of a sudden people are getting hurt. And you never meant to hurt them in the first place. Man, Herod Agrippa, as he's living with purpose, no doubt, and he has a sense of urgency, but his sense of urgency is causing other people harm. Let me ask you this, and then we'll move on. Man, is your purpose to live for his purpose? I mean, really. Is your purpose to live for his purpose? And I'm not talking about vocation, okay? Like, I'm not talking about the vocation that you're choosing to line up with. It's easy to think like, the vocation is specifically kind of what I do or things that are similar to what I do as being living for his purpose. But God doesn't call everyone to be pastors or teachers or worship leaders or those kinds of things. I mean, God certainly calls people to do that. But man, God can call you as you work, Monday through Friday from 3:30 in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the factory that he's called you to work, man, God can call you as you work at the Bowling Green Fire Department or the Bowling Green Police Department or at the medical center or at Greenview or in a school or wherever it is. Man, God can call you, but vocation aside for a moment, does your purpose, even within the context of that vocation, is your purpose to live for his purpose? Because if there's going to be an urgency that we live with for the sake of the gospel, then the purpose of our life, the purpose for which we live it, has to come in line with his purpose for us. And the first church lived with this urgency, this sense of purpose. And yet in this moment, they end up arrested. And we saw that he pleased the Jews. He proceeded to seize Peter. Check out the next verse. It says, this happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is also known as the Passover. And it says, after arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. See, Herod's used to living for the praises of other people. He don't want to tick anybody off. So when he kills James, it's before the Passover, but when he arrests when he arrests Peter with the intention of putting him to death, man, he does this during Passover. And so he knows if he kills this guy during Passover, it's going to do the opposite of what he wants. Man, he wants the approval of people. He doesn't want to tick them off. So he puts him in jail, and then he has him guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. 16 soldiers for like one guy. 16 soldiers guarding one. Just look at your neighbor for a minute and say, he must be important. Yeah, you can say it like that. He must be important. Yeah, for him to put 4 soldiers up against a guy who doesn't even have a weapon, who isn't even known at this point in his life and his ministry for carrying weapons and lashing out towards people, man, he puts like 4 squads of 16 soldiers are guarding one. And later we will learn in the story, doesn't even have any clothes on. Like what's it take to guard a naked man chained to a wall? Well, Herod apparently thinks it takes 16 soldiers because this has happened before, and Peter didn't stay in prison. Peter got busted out of prison because God made an earthquake and shackles broke and doors opened, and he went out. And so maybe he's like remembering that kind of story and going, well, it ain't going to happen this time, so let's take his clothes off of him, let's chain him to a wall, and let's put 16 soldiers around him just to make sure that he isn't going anywhere. Here, I want you to hear this. This is just kind of a truth I gleaned out of this. Man, if you start living your life with a sense of urgency, with a sense of purpose, you ought to expect opposition. If you're living your life with a sense of urgency, with a sense of purpose, you should expect opposition. As a matter of fact, if you're not receiving any opposition, if you're not having to deal with any opposition, that ought to be what's scary for you. It shouldn't be scary when you're having to deal with opposition. What ought to be scary is when you're not having to deal with opposition. If you begin to live your life intentionally for the sake of the gospel, if you begin to live your life on point for Christ, if you live with a sense of purpose of what he's calling you to, and you are living that life out with a sense of urgency as if you don't have a whole lot of time, and so you want God to do whatever it is that God's going to do, man, if you're living your life like that, you ought to expect opposition. And that's exactly what happens to Peter. Just because you follow Jesus doesn't mean you're not going to face any opposition. Just because you're following Jesus doesn't mean hardships aren't going to come your way. Just because you follow Jesus doesn't mean that you're not going to have to deal with any kind of suffering in this life. You are. Matter of fact, Jesus says, look, in this world, you will have troubles. But take heart, because I've overcome the world. Like the suffering, the troubles, the hardships, the opposition, like it may come your way, but it's not going to be the end of you. I think Peter knows that at this point. But I guess Herod didn't do his research. I just want to, for a few minutes, talk about Peter for just a moment. Peter is the guy, if you don't know much of the story, Peter's the guy. There's this moment when Jesus is with the disciples, and stay with me on this. Jesus has gathered together with his disciples, and he asks them a question. He says, who do the people say that I am? Who are people saying that I am? Jesus knows that everybody's talking about him, and I think he even knows what everybody's saying, right? Because he's God, and he can know people's thoughts, so surely he knew what everybody was saying. So Jesus isn't asking the question for his sake. He's asking the question for the sake of his disciples. And he says, all right, who do the people say that I am? And so some of the disciples start speaking up, and they said, Jesus, man, some of them say that you're like Elijah. Come back. Elijah was, he was, I tell people he was the CrossFit prophet. He was the guy who lived at like 1,000 miles per hour for God. I mean, he was the guy who could lift bulls and slaughter them, and bull's a big animal for one guy to have to slaughter by himself. I mean, he's the guy who moved stones and ran marathons. I mean, he's this incredible, the most revered prophet for the Jewish people. And they said, look, Jesus, some people are saying you're Elijah. Come back. Like you've come back and you're Elijah. They said, well, other people say that you're John the Baptist, because at this point, John the Baptist had already had his head cut off, and he was dead. And people were saying, man, you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. How else could you do the things that you're doing? I mean, how else could you open the eyes of the blind? How else could you open the ears of the deaf? Man, some people say you're Elijah, and some people say you're John the Baptist. Other people say that you're, maybe one of the other prophets. And then Jesus, he brings them in. He says, yeah, but who do you say that I am? And Peter speaks up, and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, very well, Peter, but you didn't come up with this on your own. God has revealed this to you. And then he says this, and this is powerful, and he says, and on you, Peter, the word Peter means rock, on you, on this rock, on you, Peter, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now I want you to listen to this part, because this is good stuff right here. This is purpose, right? This is urgency, but this is also battle language. Here in a few weeks, we're gonna do a series together called Breakthrough, and then we're gonna go into a series called Battle. This would have been an awesome sermon to start off either one of those, because Jesus is talking about battle language at this point. He says, look, on you, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. When Jesus talks about the church, he is talking about a living, breathing organization, a movement of people. The church is not a building. The church are the people. It's the gathering of the people. He says, I'm going to build my church, and the church is always going to be moving forward. It's always going to be advancing. It's always going to be going forward. There is a sense of purpose. There is a sense of urgency from which the church moves. It's an offensive position, right? It's an offensive stance. The church isn't putting up gates and putting up walls and holding their ground. That's not the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is to advance. It's to move forward. Jesus says, on you, I'm going to build my church, my gathering of people. And then he says this, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Gates are a defensive measure, right? Gates are things that you put up. Walls are things that you put up to put people out. Listen, when Jesus speaks of the enemy, when he speaks of the opposition, when he speaks of hell, he doesn't speak about it in offensive terms. He speaks about it in defensive terms. And what he says is the church will be moving forward, and not even the gates of the enemy, the gates of hell, the gates of the opposition will not be able to stand against the forward movement of the church. Now, I share all that with you because my guess is if you're a lot like me, there are moments when opposition begins to come our way and we start taking on whatever the attacks are from the enemy, whatever the enemy looks like, whatever the opposition looks like, and it puts us in a defensive posture, right? That's not the posture of the church. We start getting attacked on all sides, and things begin to come down on us and weigh down on us. And what we tend to do is begin to put up walls and erect gates and try to hold the gates and try to keep them out and not let them in. And that's not the position of the church. When Jesus talks about gates and walls, he's talking about the enemy. The enemy is the one who puts up the gates. The enemy is the one who puts up the walls. The enemy is the one who's always on the defense. The church is on the offense. The church is the one that is moving forward, moving against it. Maybe the reason why you're stuck this morning is that you're in a defensive posture and not in an offensive posture. Maybe the reason why you are stuck where you are and you can't seem to get out is because you're trying to hold fast the gates, and you ought to be moving out of the gates and moving forward. Living with a purpose, with a sense of urgency. But whatever's happening to you, the enemy coming against you, and again, if you decide to live with purpose, with urgency for the sake of the gospel, man, you are going to face opposition. You are going to experience attacks from the evil one, but those attacks should not shut you down. They ought to. And Jesus says, look, not even the gates of hell will prevail against my work and my power and my plan and my purpose. Let me just share this with you. Look, if you are convinced of God's promises for your life, if you are convinced of God's plan and his purpose for you, then the opposition is powerless against you. If you're convinced of his purpose, if you're convinced of his promise, if you are convinced of his plan for your life, then the opposition is powerless against you. They can threaten you with whatever they want to threaten you, but if you belong to God, it doesn't matter how much they threaten you. Peter had nothing to be scared of, even when he is naked and chained against the wall and guarded by 16 soldiers. He's got nothing to be afraid of because there is a power, there is a plan that is a part of his life that is greater than him, and it's greater than the king that has him in chains. Look, it doesn't matter what they threaten against you. It is not greater than God's plan for you. It doesn't matter what they say or what they do or how much they beat you. It doesn't matter how they come against you. It doesn't matter if they say, well, you know what? You won't have a job tomorrow then if you do that. Look, you know what? You won't have a marriage tomorrow if you do. It doesn't matter what they say or what they do or how they try to threaten you. God's plan and his power and his purpose for your life is greater than the opposition. And when you make a decision to begin to live with purpose that begins to drive that sense of urgency, you ought to expect opposition. But here's the thing, that opposition is powerless to overcome you. You're the one who gets to decide whether or not you will be overcome by what is trying to overcome you, or you will stand in his promises. Remember that song? Standing on the promises of God, whether you will stand in his promises and know that the opposition is powerless to overcome those promises. They capture Peter, and Peter must have been important and he must have known it, but he apparently didn't do his research because he missed that whole story about Peter. If he had known that story, maybe he would have been wise enough to think, man, it doesn't matter if I strip him down and chain him to a wall and guard him by 16 soldiers, that this isn't going to work. But that's what happens because I guess he just didn't do his research. And so he's holding him there over the weekend until the Passover goes by. And here's what happens in verse 5. It says, so Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. Let me ask you a question. I want to take the first half of that first. Peter was kept in prison. What's keeping you in prison today? See, I know what was keeping Peter in prison. In this moment, what's keeping Peter in prison is the word of the king. That's what's keeping him there. What's keeping Peter in prison is the fact that he's chained to a wall and he has no clothes on, and there are 16 armed soldiers who are more powerful than he is, and they're keeping. I know what's keeping Peter in prison at this moment in the passage of Scripture, but I also know that what is keeping him there is ultimately powerless to actually keep him there. What is keeping him there for a moment is ultimately powerless to actually keep him there. And so I realize this morning you're not chained to a wall without any of your clothes on, guarded by 16 soldiers, but I just wanted to ask, then what's keeping you in prison this morning? Because for some of you, you wake up every day and the prison that you live in is insecurity. And your insecurities about how you look, your insecurities about your background, the insecurities that have come on you because of what people have said to you and have spoken into your life has become this prison that you wake up in and that you live in every day. It's the prison through which you are seeing and living your life. It's a prison that God did not create you to live in. But you continue to live in your insecurities because you believe the word of somebody else over the word of your Savior. And I just wonder what prison you're staying in this morning. For some of you, it's not an insecurity thing, but it's a brokenness thing. And every single day, you wake up in a prison of your own brokenness. It's a brokenness because of what happened to you in the past. It's a brokenness because of what someone did to you when you were a little girl. It's a prison because of what someone did to you when you were a little boy. It's a prison because of what some other kid said about you when you were in the 3rd grade. And it's a prison of brokenness that you've never really dealt with and you've never really worked through. And it's coming out in all areas of your life. And sometimes you get close enough to somebody or somebody says something to you and it triggers it. And you're just reminded of the prison that you live in. You wake up in a prison of insecurity. You wake up in a prison of brokenness. And for some of you today, you wake up and it's a prison of fear. It's not something that you talk about. It's not something that you get all vocal about. It's not something, maybe people don't even know it about you. Because they think, man, you're not afraid of anything, but you're scared to death inside. You're scared to trust God at His Word. You're scared to trust God with what He's given you. You're scared to step out in faith and believe that His way is better than your way. And you wake up every day in a prison of fear. For some of you, you wake up in a prison of anxiety. And for some of you, it's a result of what's happened to you. And for some of you, it's a result of a medical thing. But regardless of how it ended up there, man, it's a prison. I just wonder what's keeping you in prison this morning. Peter's in prison in this moment. He's been in prison before, but he's not going to stay there. Now listen, there's going to be a moment when Peter's going to get put in prison. It's going to cost him his life, but that's altogether different. The reason why he's not going to stay in this prison right now is because it's not in line with God's plan and God's purpose. God's not done with Peter yet. When God's done with Peter, God will be done with Peter, and he will go on to a better place. And listen, I'm just telling you, if the prison that you're waking up in is a prison of insecurity, it's a prison of anxiety, it's a prison of fear, it's a prison of jealousy, it's a prison of whatever it is that you struggle with, I'm telling you, that's a prison that you do not have to stay in. And the reason why I know that is because God did not create you to live in a prison of insecurity. God did not create you to live in a prison of brokenness. God did not create you to live in a prison of fear. God did not create you to live in a prison of jealousy. God didn't create you to live in the prisons that we often keep ourselves in. And maybe it's up to you in this moment how much longer you're going to stay there. See, Peter was kept in prison. And he was being kept in prison by the word of a king and by the armament of a soldier. But it says, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. If you're taking notes, I want you to write down this heading, praying with urgency. The church was praying with urgency for him. This should always be the response of the church. Peter is in prison and the church goes to praying. That ought to always be the response of the church. Man, when the church is earnestly praying, that is an urgent response. When the church goes to fervent prayer, when the church is praying without ceasing. That word earnestly, underline it, circle it, make a note. It means perseverance without waver. When the church goes to praying with perseverance that cannot be wavered, man, that's a different kind of praying. That's a different kind of praying than, God, thank you for this day, and I hope it's a great day. God, help me to have a great day today. Man, the church goes to praying, and it probably looks passive to the world. It probably looks passive-aggressive if we could hear the words of those who are lifting up prayers. But there's nothing passive about what they're doing, and there's nothing passive-aggressive about what they're doing. It is one of the greatest acts of aggression that the church can do is go to prayer. To call upon a name that is higher and that is greater, that is more powerful than any other name. The church doesn't move forward by shedding blood. The church is often propelled forward when its blood is shed. If you don't believe that, then look at the cross. And Jesus says, when they lift me up, when they nail me to the cross, when my blood is shed, I will draw all people unto myself. The church went to praying as Peter was in prison, and those prayers began to change everything. This wasn't a casual kind of prayer. It wasn't a casual conversation. Man, they were pleading for his life. They were pleading for God to do something. This earnest prayer. Some of you all know what earnest prayer looks like because I've talked to you this week and you've seen the Almighty move his hand in ways that you haven't seen before because you stopped praying just regular prayers and you had to get earnestly praying about something. You started praying with an urgency. You started praying like, God, if you don't do something, God, if you don't move in this, God, if I've seen you move the mountains and I want to see you do it again. I need to see you do it again. God, I know that you're good, but I need to see your goodness again. God, I know what your peace feels like, and right now, I'm not experiencing your peace, but God, I need your peace again. And then when you go to fervently praying, when you're praying with perseverance, they cannot be wavered at all. When you're calling on God and expecting him to do something, your eyes begin to be open and you see God move in ways that you have not seen him move before. See, we don't see God move in power, not because God has lost his power, but because the church has lost its urgency. We don't see God move the way God has moved through Scripture because we don't pray like the church prayed when we look at the church in Scripture. Man, we won't come to church if the weather ain't right. We follow God on our terms, not on his. We are faithful when it's convenient to be faithful. But you won't experience the fullness and the greatness, the boldness of the Almighty so long as you follow God by your convenience. Convenience did not change the world, but a God who would inhabit the praise of his people, who would move in power, changed the world. And the people prayed. And it might have looked passive to the rest of the world. It might have looked, man, why would you respond with that? I mean, come on. You could at least do something. They've got him in prison. There's enough of you now. I mean, you could overthrow 16 guards. I mean, you guys could arm yourselves. You could arm yourselves with weapons. And you could overthrow those 16 guys and you could get him out of there. But the church did not arm themselves. The church fought with weapons that the world knows not of, and they began to call on the Almighty, the one who by his very word has the power to create and speak things into existence, the God who could close the mouths of lions, the God who could topple the power of the pharaohs, the God who could with a word cause waters to part ways and rivers to stop flowing, the God who could stand up on a boat with waves crashing around him and speak, quiet, be still, and the raging seas begin to calm out and the wind begins to die down, they are calling on a God who has the power of life and death in his hands, and they are praying fervently. They are praying earnestly. They are praying with expectation that God will move. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, because there was something that was on you, and you knew that if God did not do something, if God does not move in this, then it's the end. It's over. There's nothing else going to happen. And you took it to him in prayer, and you prayed fervently, and you prayed earnestly, and you were living with an urgency, and that was a moment in your life when you saw God move in a powerful way. And he restored your relationships, and he restored your marriage, and he restored the relationship with your children that was broken because of something that got said a long time ago. And it restored what was going on at the office. And nobody else knew. You weren't trying to manipulate it. You weren't trying to control it. You weren't trying to get your way out of it. You were just taking it before God. And it might have looked passive to everybody else. Why aren't you doing something? Don't you? You know, you could get a better lawyer and get a lot more out of this than what you're about to get out of this. But they were fighting with weapons that the world knew not of. And God moved in a powerful way. Maybe the answer for you to step out of your prison this morning is fervent, earnest prayer. Maybe the answer for you to begin to find a sense of purpose for your life again, to begin living with an urgency again, is just to be reminded of the life that you've been given and the promise that God has extended and the call that's on your life. Maybe you just need to be reminded today. Man, that little church in Ronnieville, Kentucky, Ronnieville Baptist Church, man, God began to move in a powerful way, and it all started with a reminder. They just need to be reminded. They just need to be reminded of what our eyes are supposed to be open to. They just need to be reminded of what our heart's supposed to beat for. They just needed to be reminded. And so do we. And so for the church, we have an incredible opportunity today, because today we're going to break bread together. And Jesus gave us this incredible gift. When he gathered with his disciples, Scripture says that he took the bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body given for you." And he said, as often as you eat of it, you're going to do this in remembrance of me. He was beginning something for the very first time with, check it out, a Passover meal. I didn't make this connection until right now. Dude, they're holding Peter over Passover. They were celebrating this meal together, Jesus and his disciples, maybe a decade before this. And Jesus broke the bread during the Passover. And for the first time, the disciples heard it in a way that they had never heard it before. It had always been a celebration of their coming out of Egypt into what God was promising them. But Jesus took the bread and he broke it and he said, "Now this is my body given for you." Because less than 24 hours later, he would be hanging on a cross. And he said, from now on, every time you gather together and you eat this meal together, you break this bread, you remember that my body was given for you. Likewise, it says that he took the cup, and Jesus declared it the cup of the new covenant. I'm beginning something new today. We've been celebrating an old covenant for centuries, but today, this is the cup of the new covenant, my blood poured out for you, for the forgiveness of many. And he said, take and drink this, each of you. And as often as you drink this, may you do this in remembrance of me. Sometimes we just got to be reminded. We got to be reminded of the life we've been called to. We got to be reminded of what God is calling us to. And so today, as we take communion together, it will be exactly what Jesus meant for it to be, a reminder. May that reminder call you back to purpose. May that reminder call you back to the purpose through which you were created to live. May that cause you to live with a sense of urgency, that this is a message that will change people's lives, that it is a matter of life and death. Nobody calls 911 and says, well, listen, my house will burn all day, so y'all take your time. time. No, they want the firefighters to respond with urgency. Well, they done had the heart attack, so, I mean, it is what it is. Y'all just take your time getting here. Now, yeah, they're breaking in my house, but they got a couple of more doors to go through before they get to me, so y'all just take your time, and we'll see you when you get here. Nobody calls 911 and hopes that they'll just take their time and casually get there. They expect a response of urgency. And listen, your Savior has called you to live with incredible purpose and an expectation that you would live for his namesake with a sense of urgency. May you be reminded of that today. May you be reminded. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes?